much license can you take in your memoir? The answer to this coming up. So how much can you play with the truth in your memoir? So I'm going to give you examples of 3 authors who played with the truth a little too much. So Margaret Jones had all copies of her memoir recalled. Augustine Burroughs was sued for $2 million. James Fry's book caused his publisher to face a class action lawsuit on behalf of readers. Okay, so these are extreme examples, and I'm really not here to scare you. Actually, the reason I'm bringing up these examples is because I want to show you what these authors did that caused them to get sued or that caused them to get their books recalled. And what they did was pretty dramatic. They didn't just finesse the truth, they changed it completely. In fact, in Margaret Jones' book, Love and Consequences, she basically made up her memoir. So her book was about growing up in South Central and being part of a gang, when in reality, she is a white girl who was raised in the middle-class white suburb of Sherman Oaks, north of Los Angeles. In fact, Sherman Oaks is a city best known for its shopping malls. So she just made this whole thing up. So if you're not making up huge parts of your memoir, you're probably going to be okay. Just to give an example of what James Fry did, one example is that he claimed to have spent 87 days in prison, and he wrote about this. In reality, he spent 3 hours. So this isn't just finessing the truth. This is really making up chunks of your memoir. And as long as you're not doing that, you're probably going to be okay. But I did want to talk about this idea of truth and memoir and how much license can you take? So the people who get in trouble usually have huge fabrications, probably not the kinds of things you're worried about. And memoir writers in general do need to take some kind of license, if only because of the fact that you don't remember everything that happened to you. And in order to write a good book, you need to include details and dialogue. So in this video, I want to talk about truth in memoir. How much can you play with the truth in the interest of making a better book? Let me give you an example from Mary Karr's book, The Liars Club. Let me just read you the first paragraph. I was 7, and our family doctor knelt before me, where I sat on a mattress on the bare floor. He wore a yellow golf shirt, unbuttoned, so that sprouts of hair showed in a V shape on his chest. I had never seen him in anything but a white starched shirt and a gray tie. The change unnerved me. He was pulling at the hem of my favorite nightgown, a pattern of Texas bluebonnets, bunched into nosegays, tied with ribbon against a field of nappy white cotton. I had tucked my knees under it to make a tent. He could easily have yanked the thing over my head with one motion, but something made him gentle. Show me the marks, he said. Come on now, I won't hurt you. He had watery blue eyes behind thick glasses and a mustache that looked like a caterpillar. So we have lots of details there. Not only do we have the color of the nightgown, we have the pattern on it. We have the color of the doctor's eyes. We have dialogue, what this doctor said to her when she was 7 years old. Now, does Mary Karr just have this an exceptional memory and she can remember details like this that the rest of us can't? The answer is no. All memoir writers have to take some license, and it's okay to do this. And the reality is that a reader doesn't expect the same from a memoir as they would when they read the New York Times. If they're reading the New York Times, they expect this to be factual. If you are hired by the New York Times to report on the elections, you had better write exactly what you see. However, if you're writing about the elections from memory based on elections that you lived through when you were 12 years old, you have a lot more leeway in telling the story. And you're going to tell the story differently because memoir is very different than writing for the New York Times. So readers have different expectations of memoir writing. Memoir is told in a different way. Memoir is your personal reflection, your personal account of what you've lived through. So if you're writing about the elections for the New York Times, your point of view is going to be so different. The New York Times expects you to be objective and recount exactly what you saw, record dialogue word for word. Memoir is very different. Memoir is a different art form. Playing with chronology in your book is probably one of the nicest things you can do for your reader, because sometimes if you tell your story completely chronologically, it gets really boring. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't write a chronological memoir. What I'm saying is that you can finesse the order of events as they happened in real life. When it comes to putting them in your book, you can change the order of events a little bit, just in the sake of telling a better story. To give you an example, in my book, Avoiding Prison and Other Noble Vacation Goals, I went to Honduras twice. And in the book, I condensed this into a single trip because it made a better story. Going to Honduras twice was going to drag the plot down. So I created a single trip and packed it full of all of these interesting events instead of breaking this into two different chapters, two different trips. So you can play with chronology a lot in your book. I do this sometimes with conversations I have, phone conversations I have. If I have a really great phone conversation with my mother that I want to write about, and let's say it happened 4 years ago, as opposed to the time period of my book, which might be 8 years ago, I really have no qualms about inserting that phone conversation into my book and making it actually occur in my book in a different time period. I don't feel like I'm being dishonest. And I feel like most memoir writers make similar cheats. So if you want to play with chronology in the interest of telling a better story, go for it. You're still telling events that actually happen. You're just changing the order a little bit. Dialogue. So this is a really tough one because you often do not remember dialogue. I often don't remember dialogue that happened yesterday unless I took notes. What do you do with dialogue? How do you put things in quotes that people said if they didn't actually say that word for word? Now, if you're writing for a newspaper, you really do need to write down dialogue word for word. But if you're writing for a newspaper, you're also usually recording conversations, or at the very least, you have a pen and paper in hand. And so readers expect conversation to happen word for word. With memoir, it's just impossible to spend your entire life with a tape recorder. Do people use tape recorders anymore? With a cell phone, with some type of recording device, or walking around with pen and paper your whole life. And so your reader doesn't expect you to have dialogue word for word. What you want to do is your best approximation. So you have a couple of things to work with. First of all, is your memory. You have a memory of, let's say it was a fight you had with your father when you were a child. You have a memory of that fight, and you probably have some recollection of what was said. So what you're going to do is write that down to the best of your recollection. The other thing is that you know your father. You know the way your father speaks. You know the way your father thinks. So that will also help you in reconstructing the dialogue that probably happened at that point in time. Dialogue is always going to be a reconstruction. You do the best you can based on your memory of events and based on your knowledge of the person who was speaking at the time. Physical characteristics of your characters. This is a tough one for me. This becomes a matter of personal judgment. Let me tell you why. In a lot of books, you will see a disclaimer in the front of the book that says something like, I have changed physical characteristics of some people to protect their identities, which I understand why people would do that. It gets a little tricky because I have some writers who interpret that to mean, well, if I'm going to change their physical characteristics anyway, what is the difference between kind of creating a new character? And so let's say you're writing a scene about going on a date and you want to hide the identity of the person you actually dated. And so you change who they are. What is the difference between that and just inventing a character? And I'm a little stuck on this one. This is a little bit of an ethical dilemma for me. A lot of writers feel it's totally fine to do this, and other writers feel like it's dishonest. Here's where you need to make it your own judgment call. Is that dishonest? Or are you just changing the identity of a character? Are you protecting their identity in crafting basically an entirely new character? That's something you need to decide on your own. So the last thing I want to talk about is other ways to get information when your memory fails you. Now, there are a few things you can do when it comes to filling out the details that you don't remember. Do you remember the color of the wall in your bedroom when you were 7 years old? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. If you don't remember, you have research. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to go to the internet and find out the color of the wall of your house when you were 7. But you do have old photos. So one thing you can do is you can go back to old photos to find information, these personal details about your life. That's one resource you have. Another one is the internet. And the internet obviously won't help you with personal details, but it can help you with historical facts. So, what song was I listening to? I don't really remember. So you can go to the internet and see what song was popular at the time. And that can help you fill out these details. I'm pretty sure that's what Mary Carr does in her book. She doesn't remember what nightgown she was actually wearing when she was 7. I'm guessing, I haven't asked Mary Carr about this, but I'm guessing she doesn't remember, but she probably remembers, I had a favorite nightgown when I was 7 years old, and I'm sure I was wearing that one. So that's another thing you can do. You can take information that you know about your life and you can insert it into a particular scene. So did you have a favorite pair of shoes that you always wore? Well, in the scene that you're writing, you can describe those shoes because you probably were wearing them. And these are the kinds of cheats that almost all memoir writers have to make in order to include those details that make the story interesting. So these are details that you may not have been part of your memory of that scene, but you are inserting them into the scene to make the scene more interesting. You're not making up the details. You're just taking details that you know about your life and you're combining them into a scene to make that scene more interesting. So you have several tools at your disposal. You have your memory, use it to the best of your ability. You also have details from other times in your life. You have objects around this time that you might remember, and you can take those objects and insert them into a particular scene just to add a little bit more richness. Use your memory. You can also research. You also have the internet. You can research songs that were playing at the time, fashion that was trendy. So do the best you can and don't stress out about this. Now, if you're going to be talking about a historical event, I would definitely do research because other people can look this up and say, wait, that didn't happen in the month of August, as she's claiming. Elections tend to happen in November. So be careful about facts like this that can be referenced historically. However, when it comes to your own life, don't worry too much about these details. Your reader doesn't really care whether you were wearing a yellow shirt or a red shirt with pink flowers. In the end, what your reader cares about is the truth of your story, the emotional truth of your story. And you always want to be faithful to that. What is the message behind your story? What do you really want to say? That's something you never want to compromise on. Last thing I want to say is that when it comes to these cheats, when it comes to finessing the truth, you always want to admit it in the preface to your book. In the first pages of your book, if you're putting it with the acknowledgments or wherever you want to put this disclaimer, you want to admit in general terms what kind of license you took. So as long as you have this disclaimer, it's really up to you how much license you want to take. That decision finally is up to you, as long as you admit to it in the preface of your book. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please click like. Don't forget to subscribe. And for a free class on memoir writing, click on the link right below this video. Take care, guys.